When I tell you that there is an art movement that changed the world, I do not mean doves and flowers give peace a chance kind of nonsense. You hear me? I'm talking governments toppled, economies revamped, histories rewritten, religions outlawed. This thing that happened at the beginning of the 20th century in the art world in Russia, of all places, has cast a shadow so large, you and I are still living in it. And this is when you tell me, oh Nadia, that sounds so interesting. I wonder what that art looks like. Well, no sugar, that's interesting. That's why I'm telling you about it. And that's when I would take you by the hand and bring you into a museum, right into one of those modern galleries, and point at a bunch of squares and squiggles and stains. Okay, and I know exactly what you're thinking. I can hear you thinking, oh no, it's just another bunch of those modern art things that I just never get. I have a lot of people in my life who I love dearly who are not art people, and they say that they don't get this stuff, and I understand it. This stuff looks really weird, and it is kind of the point, which is like an infuriating thing to say about art. But the reason you don't get it, Carrie, is because you haven't met these guys. If you know just a few things about the Russian Avant-Garde, not only do you gain a better understanding of one of the most fun and terrifying points in modern history, you get a better understanding of whatever it is that we call art today. So this is what this video is going to be about. Just a few things to know to get Russian Avant-Garde. Let's get it. We're going to get it. So let's imagine that the first time you encounter this kind of art, you do it by looking at this little guy right here. So what you're looking at is a small rectangular canvas with a bunch of geometric shapes kind of scattered around its white background. And at first you can think that there's no particular logic to the way in which these geometric shapes are organized on canvas. Seemingly they can be arranged in any of these configurations and still have the same aesthetic effect. But of course, the longer you look at it, the more you realize that there is a logic in which these rectangular shapes are put on canvas. For instance, you will notice that there is a kind of gradual increase in size that we see coming from that tiny little green circle at the bottom of the canvas. Shapes seem to float out, right, or expand coming from that singular point. Another thing that you will notice, of course, is also the kind of colors that you get in this particular work. This deep, intense purple that we can see in that larger rectangle up top. But then we have very blunt, simple colors. We have this bright yellow and deep blue, bright red and green, and of course, white and black. It seems as if the artist just took the pigment straight out of the painter's tube and applied it to canvas. There was no fidgeting around different hues. Green is a green, a red is a red, a yellow is a yellow, blue is a blue, white and black. And then purple gets a little interesting, but it doesn't really dominate and it doesn't really take away from the simplicity of this composition. This is when you might also begin to look at the title, right? The titles usually tell us what the painting is really about. And what you'll read is painterly realism of a football player. Color masses in the fourth dimension. Okay, so we're looking at a painting of a football player. And depending on how generous you are to this particular artist, you can say, well, sure, I kind of see it, right? So we have this little green circle that can represent a ball, then these long rectangles that can kind of remind us of the organization of a soccer field, and these floating geometric figures that can kind of stand for an athlete in motion. But of course, this interpretation is not a satisfying one, right? You kind of understand that this painting is not about soccer. The painter is not trying to get us to think about the beauty of soccer as a sport, the dynamics of it as a game, but rather it wants us to think about reality. It is a painterly realism of a football player. So this blunt, unapologetic statement about painterly reality, about art's relationship to real life, is what places this humble canvas in the context of a larger art historical moment at the beginning of the 20th century, where artists strove to precisely challenge the existing perceptions of both reality and art. These are the artists that belong to a movement that we call today the Russian Avant-Garde. And we call it the Russian Avant-Garde not because all artists that belong to this particular movement were ethnically Russian, but because it emerges in the context of the Russian Empire come Soviet Union. So I thought I'd clarify that. Okay, so the first helpful thing you need to know about the avant-garde is that it is a military metaphor. Avant-garde comes to us from French, and it is a military word that describes the foremost part of the army, the first line of offense that clears the way for the rest. These are the people that take the biggest risks and meet the enemy first. So what does it mean to take this military term and apply it to the arts? This kind of thinking about the arts really begins to happen early 19th century. So for example, we have the socialist French thinker Henri de Saint-Simon say that artists are the advanced guard of the future. So there is a kind of understanding that artists somehow propel us into the future, make way for us to enter a new stage in our histories. Or, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche writes that to engage in war and conquest and to lay waste to old values, this is the artist's joy. So here you want to understand that this language of militaristic violence, of destruction, is injected into the thinking about the arts. No longer are the arts practices of communicating with the muses and creating something out of thin air. Art is now begins to be understood as a practice of destruction and creation of something on top of the wasteland of what has been. And frankly, by the time we get to avant-garde, we already have had a long history of artists doing precisely that, of artists rebelling, of artists challenging established tastes and fashions when it comes to art. And to kind of better understand the scandal that was the avant-garde and its political and aesthetic claim, it helps to know a little bit about what has come before it. So I'll tell you just a few things that are happening in the cultural makeup of Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century and how artists are also beginning to understand that their artistic practices are not just formal musings, but can have a material impact on the world with which these artists live. So, artists rebel. At the end of the 19th century Russia, what are they rebelling against? At the end of the 19th century, the Imperial Academy of the Arts really rules the game. It sets the tone, it maintains the taste, it trains the artists and tells them exactly what kind of art is proper and beautiful within the confines and the safety of the imperial palace's walls. In this painting, for example, you can see the kind of art the Academy would be celebrating. These beautiful, robust Rococo and Baroque canvases of mythological scenes, historical epics, really idealized, beautiful, romanticized compositions. And this is the time where this kind of art is available only to a select few, only to aristocracy, only to people who have a way of entering these privileged spaces. And of course, it was only a matter of time when someone would take issue with this aesthetic program. So first, we have the wanderers, or передвижники, a relatively small group of academically trained artists that disagreed with the tastes of the Academy. They wanted to challenge the elitist aesthetic promoted by the Academy by radically changing and shifting to a new subject matter. A lot of their canvases often turn to the themes of poverty, political repression, depravity of the peasant life in Russian Empire at the time. But the most important part of the project, and one that is most significant for our conversation today, is that they wanted to democratize art. So not only did they turn to the scenes of life of the peasants, they would travel with their works and bring their canvases to places that were unfavored by the palace, right? So they wanted to bring their art to a wider audience. In response to wanderers that wanted to bring art into life, into the masses, we have the world of art, led by Sergei Diaghilev, who was an art critic and impresario, who wanted to bring art back into the realm of art. And this was a more kind of elitist club that insisted on art for art's sake. This movement that consisted predominantly of the aristocracy turned to themes of European Romanticism and early modernism. They also challenged the tastes of the academy because they saw it as too conservative. So they wanted to look not only at classical mythology and historical epics, they also wanted to turn to folk motifs and Russian theater as a way of injecting national themes with this European taste. And last but not least, I would mention symbolism, which is a booming art and literary movement at the end of 19th century that saw the arts as a conduit to a greater mythic knowledge. Symbolists believed that the material world was nothing but a shadow of a higher spiritual reality. They often turned to religious and mythical themes to illustrate a path to a greater metaphysical transcendence. So these are very romantic, very dramatic works. A lot of symbolists upheld occult doctrines, were very interested in the rising field of psychology, but they definitely privileged feeling and evocation over fact and empiricism. So for them, art was really able to change and engage one's spirit in a meaningful and transformative way. So this is the kind of cultural soup at the end of the 19th century from which the avant-garde later emerges. And what you want to see in all of these three movements that I've highlighted is that they all see art as being capable of changing material reality in a way. So we have morally driven art that wanted to change society, right? Wanted to democratize art. We have aesthetically driven art that wanted to change taste, wanted to educate people on what is beautiful. And then we have spiritually driven art that believed that through its forms and practices, one can achieve a different spiritual state and transform one's soul. So society, taste, soul, or psyche, all of this begins to emerge as potential fields where art can make an impact. And while these three movements wanted to change just one of these things, the Russian avant-garde wanted to do it all. I mean, how cool was that graphic? Did you see that? There's a quote by an American writer, Ben Lerner. He says that the avant-garde is a military metaphor that forgets that it's a metaphor. And I think that's such a beautiful encapsulation of what the avant-garde is, because I think that's exactly right. Avant-garde makes very strong claims and then forgets that it exists within the space of art. And on the one hand, you can say, well, art has always been making very big claims. And what I mean by that is that art tends to represent unrepresentable, right? We have art that represents gods. We have art that represents monarchs, nations, other worlds. But before avant-garde, this kind of art existed in special spaces, right? In churches, galleries, palaces, private collections even. Those spaces are special. They're almost sacred. And art existed and functioned and yielded its power within those confines. Like, it understood itself as having limits. The three movements that I've just briefly described to you made attempts of breaking that membrane that separated art and life. And what avant-garde does is that it shatters it completely. It bursts through it very forcefully because it believes that it can actually materially achieve what it metaphorically promises. So we have this art here that wanted to break into life. And in a way, it was the perfect time for it to do that because life at the beginning of the 20th century looked like this. It is nearly impossible to divorce the Russian avant-garde from its ideological companion, communism, and the historical context within which it emerged, which are the first couple of very tumultuous decades of the 20th century in Russia. Communism comes to the Russian Empire as a dream for a fairer, better society. A dream that is extremely attractive at the time of staggering social inequality, where a little under 10% of the entire population of the empire controls all of the nation's wealth. This economic situation, as well as autocratic policies of Tsar Nicholas II that is trying to maintain power at the time, result in growing dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime. Dissatisfaction among the peasantry and the working classes, but also, and most crucially, among nobility that is very sympathetic to the plight of the poor and are frankly tired of many of the policies of the Tsarist regime. In 1905, Russia experienced its first revolution, which was a wave of mass protests sparked by peasant uprising, military mutinies, and again, general dissatisfaction with the Tsar. People were demanding constitutional reforms, civil liberties, and the end of the absolute rule of the monarch. So that year, being under a lot of pressure, the Tsar makes some concessions. He, for example, creates Duma, which is a kind of form of parliament. Though in practice, of course, he retains most of the power. And things stay like that for a while. In 1914, of course, we know the World War I begins and Russia enters that war, but the dissatisfaction with the regime is growing exponentially. And then, boom, we have 1917. In February of that year, the second revolution forces Nicholas II to abdicate. A provisional government, a temporary government, is put into place, promising elections and democratic reforms in the future. The idea was that they would wait for the First World War to be over to hold a kind of universal election to decide Russia's political future. But things don't go according to plan, and in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks seize the power in what is essentially a coup. Unlike the moderate socialists and liberals of the provisional government, the Bolsheviks are not interested in parliamentary democracy. They want to dismantle capitalism altogether and start building a socialist state with the long-term goal of igniting a global communist revolution. So the long-term goal for the Bolsheviks was would call it domination, they'd call it liberation. They wanted to liberate the working classes of the world from the oppressive, industrial, capitalist way of life that was so predominant in the 19th century. And so they wanted to build a socialist state with the long-term goal for a communist utopia by following Marx's historical outline. So these are the steps that the Bolsheviks kind of roughly had in mind going into their political project. So how does Marx describe our journey on the way to a communist utopia? So Marx says that in an industrially developed society, there will come a point when the proletariat, or the working classes, the producers, will seize the means of production. They will take over the state, they will take over the factories, they will abolish private property, and basically work towards a kind of egalitarian society that at its core has values of economic equality, justice, all that kind of good stuff. Then, after an establishment of a socialist state, Marx says, there will come a point where a communist utopia will emerge, a communist society. In a communist society, there will be no classes, right? So there will be no economic disparity, and you can kind of imagine why that idea would be so attractive to a country where so much of life is dictated by poverty and inequality. So there'll be no private property, there will be no state, we're abolishing the state, there will be no money, we're abolishing the money. The production of goods will be undertaken based on need and not greed, and people would be generally free to develop and flourish without being oppressed by powers that be. So what happens in reality is a little different. But for now, what you want to understand is that our artists, the avant-garde artists, are entering into this time period as understanding themselves as being part of the revolutionary project. But much like the Bolsheviks had no blueprint of how to build a socialist society, really. Like, they didn't have a blueprint on how to move from a bourgeois middle-class economy into a proletariat economy, and Bolsheviks had to improvise. Like, for example, there was a time where they tried to abolish all money, you know, and like that didn't quite work out as well. But the point is that they had to experiment, they had to improvise. So did the artists, because they understood that if we are building this new world, if we are building a society that is meant to do away with history of oppression and inequality, the art that this new world, this new society would have to look completely different and function in a completely different way. And what is most important, participate in the project of liberation and revolution. Kazimir Malevich writes that the artist can be neither a servant nor a mere spectator of life. He is a creator of a new world. Lisitsky writes that the artist has to step down from his pedestal and become a constructor, right? So again, we're moving towards a kind of horizontal, egalitarian society where the artist does not occupy this privileged place where he talks to the muses and follows his heart, follows his whim. No, the artist is grounded in the material reality, in the reality of building a new space. Alexander Rodchenko says the artist must be a constructor, an engineer, art into life. Lyubov Popova wrote that our new aim of the arts is the organization of the material environment. And all active artistic creativity must be directed towards this. Do you remember that quote by the French socialist about artists being avant-gardes of the future, right? Kind of pushing us into a new reality, into a new historical moment. And then, this is my favorite, Sergei Eisenstein, a filmmaker, wrote that cinema is a tractor. Oh, I love him so much. Cinema is a tractor that plows deeply into the audience's psyche. Someone needs to put that on a t-shirt. But here, again, you want to see a kind of understanding of an art object as an active, almost mechanical, material force that changes the psyche of its viewers, right? Not only are artists were to participate in designing and constructing the material world were also meant to be reflected in the souls and the beings of the people who both looked at it and made it. Since now we have art that has a completely different function and it does something completely different, it also had to look completely different as well. So the third and final thing to know about Russian avant-garde is the difference in diversity of its forms. Recognizing much of the same problems its predecessors did, the avant-garde radically fractures its historical moment with a completely innovative approach to art making abstracted, weird-looking, aesthetically consistent, politically engaged works. And while the avant-garde artists strove for the same goal, they had different ideas of how to get there. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we have this proliferation of different isms. There are different artistic practices that stress political power of certain aesthetic forms that orient that particular art towards the goal of building a communist utopia. Here's what they look like and why. First, we have primitivism, and this is where many artists turn away from the highbrow academic aesthetics and look to the religious and folk art to find new aesthetic solutions for the forging of the universal revolutionary aesthetics. And what I mean by that is they looked at icons, frescoes, everyday peasant objects as a way to return to their national roots and radically negate Western taste and Western aesthetics. Many of these artists were trained as icon painters and decorative artists as well, so they brought this skill into articulating new aesthetic projects. So they take this art and reimagine it at a time of industrialization and political rise of populism, socialism. A few examples of what it looked like. Lisitsky, for example, once illustrating Jewish fairy tales, turns to the language of geometric abstraction, keeping the narrative and color schemas of the folk tales. Kazimir Malevich, who we already looked at, reimagines the scene of everyday peasant life through the language of severe abstraction, subtracting these scenes to their most essential forms. Or Natalia Goncharova, who carries the aesthetics of Orthodox iconography into cubist-like compositions. So the borrowings are thematic and formal, taking on different looks, but you see that they all strive to sharpen and reduce and simplify and dramatize to meet the urgency of the political moment. And no one quite sharpens and simplifies and dramatizes like Kazimir Malevich, who creates art movement which is called suprematism. So born in a family of Polish-Ukrainian beet farmers, Kazimir Malevich was educated in Moscow and was closely familiar with European art movements like Impressionism, Cubism, and Symbolism. He wanted to invent a visual language that would transcend representation entirely, believing that naturalism and realism in painting was nothing but illusionism and aestheticism that drew art away from the material reality of the country in turmoil. Suprematism was conceived in 1915 as an art that would put an end to representational art and finally focus on the material reality of painterly realism, which would allow art to serve as a site of metaphysical revelation. Suprematism arrives at the scene in 1915 when Malevich exhibits his famous black square, placing it under the top corner of the room, the place that is generally allotted to hanging of icons in peasant homes. This is the icon of the new time, the transcendent black. In his 1915 manifesto, Malevich writes, "I have transformed myself in the zero of form and have fished myself out of the rubbishly slot of academic art. I have destroyed the ring of the horizon and escaped from the circle of things." And last and final ism I will tell you about is constructivism, which initially actually posed a challenge to Malevich's conception of this new art. And constructivists were actually really fun. They're quite frankly my favorite. So remember how in those quotes that I read earlier, where artists describe their new role in their historical moment, they refer to themselves repeatedly as constructors. So that's basically the idea here. Constructivists engage industrial materials and focused on the structural properties of the objects they created. It was as if the artist went to the factory, that art had to engage with the material reality of the country that is trying to industrialize at a neck-break speed. Constructivists were adamant about eliminating canvas and easel as a dividing agent between art and life. Instead of the painterly idea of composition, the way in which elements of the painting are organized on the canvas to create a cohesive whole, they emphasized construction, which they saw as a lawful, as in a natural scientific law, principle of organization that presupposes a scientific necessity. Not arbitrary whim of an artist, but an actual material law of the actual material world. These spatial constructions insisted on being subject to the same natural laws and historical forces as their makers and viewers. All these artistic experimentations were not just instances of play. American art critic Clement Greenberg, for example, writes that the most important function of the avant-garde was not to experiment, but to find a path by which it would be possible to keep culture moving in the midst of ideological confusion and violence. And the idea of this movement and dynamism and urgency with which these new forms emerged at the beginning of the 20th century is something that is precisely at the heart of the avant-garde and that helps you to understand its aesthetic claim. The idea of socially engaged art, art that critiques, that challenges, that declares, that strives to abolish, should be very familiar to you today, as well as the idea that our aesthetic sensibilities impact and sometimes inform our political positions. The avant-garde encouraged that. When we talk about images, we say that we are bombarded with them, right? Which is a word that describes a military attack. But I don't mean to let the avant-garde off the hook so quickly, because it made us a promise. It wanted to create a new world. It wanted to create not just a different world, it wanted to contribute to a very specific political project. Did it succeed? Did painterly realism of Malevich really lead to a communist utopia? Well, it kind of didn't, right? Because last time I checked, Soviet Union was anything but a utopia. So was it good for nothing? Is the avant-garde, much like, let's be frank, so many art movements, fundamentally politically inconsequential? One way to dramatize this question could be to ask, is the avant-garde a military metaphor that forgets that it's a metaphor, art that breaks into life? Can we hold it accountable for whatever happens in that life that it broke into, for whatever happens in that reality? In other words, is the black square to blame for labor camps that come around a couple of decades after its exhibition? That's a scary and titillating question. And if you find it just as interesting as I do, you should click on this video where I tell you about an art movement that came after avant-garde and arguably succeeded where avant-garde has failed. Yeah, I hope to see you there. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.